The red dust of the Arizona Territory did not settle. It lived in the air, a constant, fine grit that coated Eleanor Hartley's tongue and clung to the damp cambric of her traveling dress. After weeks cooped in the rocking confines of the stagecoach, the stop at Sulphur Springs Station felt less like a reprieve and more like being dumped from a skillet into the fire. The sun was a white hammer in the sky. Heat radiated invisible waves from the packed earth of the yard, where a half-finished adobe station house stood beside a sprawling canvas trading tent and a corral of sweating, fly-tormented horses. New telegraph poles, raw and smelling of pine resin, marched away across the scorched landscape, their single strand of wire humming with a sound Nell had never heard before. It was not the busy, familiar chatter of Boston's wires, but a high, lonely peal, like some strange mechanical bird calling out a warning. Each faint chirp seemed to measure the miles that now separated her from everything she had ever known. 18 years old, and her life had been bartered for the promise of copper buried under some distant mountain. Her guardian, a man whose face she could barely recall, had signed the papers, a Reverend Abel Pritchard, all pious words and greedy eyes, had arranged the transport. She was a parcel, crated and shipped west to be the wife of a man she had never met. An Apache chief, they said, a political alliance sealed with her body. Survive, she told herself, the litany a small, hard stone in her gut. Survive the journey, guard your honor, and find a way out. The stage driver, a leathery man named Jeb, swung her single trunk down from the boot. It was a fine trunk of Boston make, with her initials E.H. elegantly painted on the lid. Inside lay the remnants of her old life dresses, books, a sewing kit, a station hand. His face flushed with drink and heat, shambled over. He grunted, grabbing a canvas pouch of documents from Jeb and slapping a sticky, pre-written luggage tag onto her trunk. He did the same to a smaller, cruder wooden box belonging to another passenger, a geologist heading for the new mines. The man fumbled with the manifests, his thumbs smudging the ink. Nell watched with a detached sort of dread, too weary and overwhelmed to notice the casual sloppiness of the exchange, the way the man's eyes glazed over the names without truly reading them. A cloud of that ever-present red dust heralded the arrival of riders from the east, United States Cavalry. They rode with a jangling efficiency, their blue uniforms dark with sweat, led by an officer whose posture was as rigid as the telegraph poles. Captain Silas Creed dismounted, his gaze sweeping the squalid station with undisguised contempt. He ignored Nell completely, his attention fixed on the Western Trail. He was waiting. Nell's stomach tightened. She was the reason for this military presence, the precious cargo for a treaty. Reverend Pritchard had assured her of her importance, her role as a peacemaker, a bride of destiny. The words had sounded grand in a Boston parlor. Out here, under the pitiless sun, they felt like a shroud. From the west, another group appeared. They did not ride in formation but flowed over the low hills like water, their ponies stirring little dust. They were Apache, and their presence silenced the station yard. The hostlers froze. The station master vanished inside his office, and even Captain Creed's men shifted in their saddles. The leader dismounted. He was tall for his people, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to mock the stiff formality of the soldiers. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple cotton shirt. His black hair was held back by a leather band. He did not look at Creed, nor at Nell. His focus was on a covered wagon that had arrived with the cavalry, a wagon from which 2 troopers were now pulling a young Apache woman. This man, Nell would later learn, was Connie, whom the whites called Cain. He was here not for a bride, but to prevent a trade. His sister and their people were being starved out, pressured to abandon their ancestral valley for the desolate San Carlos reservation. Creed and the railroad baron, Horace Bell, were using every tool to force them out, and today's tool was a young woman from his band, traded for a promise of rifles that would never materialize. His goal was simple: get the girl, Chayton, and melt back into the hills before Creed could seal the trap. The negotiations began without words. Captain Creed gestured curtly toward the Apache girl. One of his men held her arm. She was terrified, her eyes wide. Kane stood impassive, but a muscle worked in his jaw. He said something in his language, his voice low and calm. Another Apache man beside him held up a beautifully beaded pouch. Creed shook his head, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. He pointed toward Nell's trunk, then toward Nell herself. The contract, his gesture said, the woman for the treaty rights. The terms were changing. It was the station hand who sealed their fates, eager to be done with the tense affair. He shoved Nell's papers into the hands of the officer nearest him. "Bring the woman forward," Captain Creed ordered. The soldier took Nell's arm. His grip was firm, impersonal. She felt a wave of nausea. This was it, the moment of delivery. Kane saw the transaction, the white woman being moved, and understood a piece of Creed's treachery. But his focus was on Chayton. She wore a simple doe-skin dress, and tied to her wrist was a small, brightly colored scarf, a private signal to him that she was ready. Creed was speaking, his voice a self-satisfied drone about agreements and the rule of law. Horace Bell, a portly man in a dusty suit who had been lurking near the trading tent, stepped forward, rubbing his hands together. The railroad needed this land. The mines needed this land. And this girl, this piece of Boston porcelain, was the key. Then Kane moved. It was not a charge, but a blur. One moment he was standing still. The next he was beside the wagon, his knife appearing in his hand. He did not use it on the guards. He slashed the leather strap holding a spare wheel to the side of the wagon. The heavy wheel crashed to the ground. A horse shrieked and reared, its hooves lashing out. The trooper holding Chayton was thrown off balance. In that single second of confusion, Kane grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her behind him. The yard exploded into chaos. Soldiers shouted, drawing their pistols. The other Apache warriors surged forward, not to fight, but to create a screen of movement and dust. A shot rang out, then another. Nell was shoved forward by her guard, stumbling as he turned to face the commotion. The stagecoach, its new team of horses spooked by the noise, lurched sideways. Nell lost her footing on the coach step. She cried out, a small, unheard sound in the bedlam, and tumbled from the wagon. She landed hard in the dirt. The breath knocked from her lungs. The world was a maelstrom of pounding hooves, gunshots, and panicked shouts, all of it seen through a thick, roiling cloud of red dust. She was directly between the soldiers and the Apache. For a terrifying moment, she thought she would be trampled. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands covering her head. When the dust began to settle, the yard was strangely altered. The Apache warriors were already pulling back, melting away with the same fluid speed they had arrived with. Chayton was gone, vanished with them. But Kane remained. He stood over a soldier who was groaning on the ground, his leg bent at an unnatural angle from a horse's kick, and near Nell, lying in the dust where Chayton must have dropped it, was the brightly colored scarf. Captain Creed's face was a mask of fury. "Seize him!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Kane. Two soldiers advanced, their rifles leveled. Kane did not look at them. His dark eyes found Nell, still kneeling in the dirt, her Boston dress now the color of the earth. He saw the scarf beside her. His mind, accustomed to reading the subtlest signs of the land, made a split-second leap. The plan had changed. Creed had changed it. The white woman was now part of the exchange. The scarf lay at her feet. In the flawed logic of the moment, the symbol became the substance. This was the one he was meant to take, a mistaken redemption. Before the soldiers could reach him, he moved to Nell. He did not offer a hand. He simply bent and looped the fallen scarf around her wrist, his fingers brushing her skin. The touch was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her. He straightened up, his gaze locking with Captain Creed's. His voice was quiet, yet it carried across the yard with absolute authority. "She is ours. The debt is paid." Creed stared, momentarily baffled by the sheer audacity of the claim. "That is Miss Eleanor Hartley of Boston," he sputtered. "She is here under federal protection, part of a treaty agreement with—" Kane cut him off. Her sign was given. He gestured to the scarf on her wrist. "The law of exchange is satisfied. We will take her." It was a lie built on a mistake, a bluff of epic proportions, but in the lingering confusion, it held a strange power. Horace Bell stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage. That woman is my key to the San Pedro Valley." Nell finally found her voice. She scrambled to her feet, her hands clenched. "I am not a piece of freight," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and indignation. Kane turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were deep and unreadable, like pools of shadow. "Out here," he said, his voice calm and even. "People count breaths, not papers." The meaning was clear. Her papers, her name, her entire identity meant nothing. All that mattered was the living, breathing fact of her presence in this impossible situation. Captain Creed seemed to recover his senses. "You will not leave this station," he snarled, his hand going to the pistol at his belt. "I will have this road blocked within the hour." Kane knew he was right. He had moments, nothing more. He gave a sharp, whistled command. A riderless pony, nimble and swift, detached itself from the receding group of warriors and trotted to his side. Without another word, Kane took Nell's arm. His grip was not brutal, but it was unbreakable. He pulled her toward the pony. "Stop!" Creed yelled, raising his pistol. Kane did not stop. He swung himself onto the pony's back and, with a strength that shocked her, pulled Nell up to sit in front of him. She was wedged against him, her back to his chest. The smell of dust and horse and something else, something wild and clean, filling her senses. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. He kicked the pony into motion. A bullet sang past her ear. She flinched, burying her face against his shoulder. The pony scrambled up a low rise, leaving the chaos of the station behind. Nell risked a glance back. She saw Captain Creed shouting orders, Horace Bell waving his fists in fury, and her fine Boston trunk sitting alone in the yard, its elegant initials already filmed with a layer of red dust. The newly strung telegraph wire hummed its strange, alien song, a prophecy of the storm that had just broken over her life, erasing everything she had been. She was no longer Eleanor Hartley of Boston. She was a captive, a mistake, a piece of a puzzle she could not comprehend, being carried deeper into the vast, unknowable heart of the American West. They rode until the sounds of the station, the shouting and the gunshots, were devoured by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. The landscape that unrolled before Nell was a terrifying masterpiece of ochre, rust, and bleached bone. Giant saguaro cacti stood like silent, tormented sentinels, their arms raised to a sky the color of a hot forge. The air was thin and so dry it felt sharp in her lungs. Every breath was an effort. Every beat of the pony's hooves kicked up a fine, red powder that settled on her skin, in her hair, and at the back of her throat, a relentless seasoning of grit. She was held fast against Kane's back, a prisoner of his unyielding arm around her waist. The proximity was a constant, humiliating reminder of her powerlessness. She could feel the hard planes of his body, the heat of him through their clothes, the subtle shifts of muscle as he guided the pony through a terrain that offered no obvious path. Her anger was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. It was a useless anger. She knew, but it was all she had. Fear was a liquid thing, sloshing just beneath it, threatening to drown her. After what felt like hours, he finally reined the pony to a halt in the shade of a rock outcropping that leaned like a tired giant. He slid to the ground and then, without a word, reached up and lifted her down. Her legs, numb and weak, buckled beneath her. She would have fallen if he had not held her arm for a moment longer than necessary. He released her, and she stumbled back, putting a few feet of distance between them. He went about his work with an economy of motion that was both fascinating and infuriating. He unsaddled the pony, rubbing its back with a handful of dry grass. He took a small water skin from his side and drank, a short, measured swallow. He did not offer her any. The oversight, so casual and complete, stoked her fury. Did he think she was an animal, a piece of luggage he had acquired? "Do I get any water?" she demanded, her voice rasping. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Later, when the sun is less hungry?" He turned away, walking to the edge of the shade to scan the horizon. His words made a certain brutal sense, but she refused to accept them. She was Eleanor Hartley. She was a lady, and she was thirsty. The silence stretched, broken only by the buzz of some unseen insect and the soft sigh of the wind. She watched him, this silent, self-contained man who had stolen her. He moved as if he were a part of this desolate land, his skin the color of the sun-baked earth, his black hair a slash of darkness against the shimmering heat. She was a smudge of white and gray, a thing of cambric and lace, utterly out of place. When he finally deemed the sun low enough, he led her on foot, pulling the pony behind him. He set a grueling pace, not on the flat ground, but up through a maze of arroyos and rock falls. This was no trail a wagon could follow, nor even one a cavalry patrol would choose. It was a ghost trail, a path written in a language of shadows and stone that only he could read. Her fine Boston shoes, meant for cobblestones and carriages, were shredded within the first mile. The thin soles offered no protection from the sharp rocks. Soon, every step was a fresh agony. She bit her lip until it bled, refusing to cry out, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her weakness. He taught her without seeming to teach. He would stop and point. "See the clouds gather there. Rain will fall on that mountain tonight. We will not be there." Or, "The wind speaks from the west. It will be cold after the dark comes." He showed her how to break open a barrel cactus and chew the pulp for its bitter moisture, how to find the shady side of a rock and dig for cooler sand to rest in. She listened with a sullen resentment, her mind a fortress of outrage, but her body, her parched, aching, exhausted body, was a traitor. It learned. It had to. The first night was colder than she could have ever imagined. The desert gave up its heat completely, the air turning sharp and thin. He made a small, smokeless fire in a hollow of rock, using dry mesquite wood. He gave her a piece of tough, dried meat, and finally, a sip of water from the skin. It was barely enough to wet her tongue, but it was nectar. She watched him across the flickering flames, her fear warring with a new, unwelcome feeling of grudging dependence. Days bled into one another, each a new lesson in deprivation. Her anger began to fray at the edges, worn thin by the constant struggle for survival. Then the storm came. It began not with clouds, but with a change in the light. The sky turned a sickly, bruised yellow. The air grew heavy and still. The wind died completely. "We must find cover," Kane said, his usual calm sharpened with urgency. "Now." He pulled her into a narrow fissure between two massive boulders just as the world dissolved. The wind hit them like a physical blow, a solid wall of air and sand that screamed and tore at them. The sun vanished. The sky vanished. There was only the roaring darkness and the sting of a million tiny needles against her exposed skin. Nell pressed herself against the rock, terrified. The sheer, elemental violence of it was beyond anything she could have conceived. In the swirling chaos, she lost her bearings, lost sight of Kane, who was only a few feet away. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She cried out his name, the words stolen from her lips by the gale. A hand closed on her arm. It was firm, grounding her in the maelstrom. He pulled her deeper into the crevice, sheltering her body with his own. They huddled there as the storm raged, the sound of physical pressure against her ears. She could feel the fine grit working its way into her clothes, her hair, her very pores. When it finally passed, as suddenly as it had arrived, the landscape was transformed. The world was softer, the sharp edges of the rocks blurred by a fresh coat of sand. The air was thick with haze. Nell's face felt raw, burned by the wind. She could feel the heat radiating from her own skin. Kane looked at her. His eyes narrowed. He moved to the base of the rock where a small, dead fire pit from some long-ago traveler was buried. He scraped away the new sand, uncovering a patch of cool, gray ash. He took a cloth from his belt pouch and dampened it with a precious splash of water from his skin. Then he mixed the water with the ash, making a thin, gray paste. Before she could react, he was kneeling in front of her. "Hold still," he commanded softly. He gently, carefully, spread the cool paste over her cheeks, her nose, her forehead. The touch of his fingers was surprisingly light. It was not a caress. It was the practical, impersonal gesture of a man tending to a valuable animal. But it was also the first gentle touch she had received in what felt like a lifetime. The coolness of the paste soothed the burning of her skin. She was too stunned, too utterly spent, to pull away. She simply sat there, her eyes closed, as he ministered to her. The act was so strangely intimate, so rooted in the harsh reality of their situation, that it bypassed all her defenses. In the aftermath of the storm, he found the tracks. 5 riders, their horses shod. Not soldiers, bounty hunters. "Bell's men," he said, more to himself than to her. "They search for the railroad's bride." Hearing herself described that way, like a piece of property with a price on her head, sent a chill through Nell despite the heat. She was a commodity to everyone. Her guardian, the Reverend, Captain Creed, Horace Bell, and now this man. The only difference was the nature of the transaction. Kane's caution intensified. He became a ghost. He led them over stony ground that would hold no prints, through thickets of thorny mesquite that tore at their clothes. At one point, he dismounted, lifted her from the pony, and carried her for 100 yards across a stretch of soft sand before setting her down on rock again, leaving only his moccasin prints to be scoured away by the ever-present wind. They backtracked, laid false trails, and finally took refuge high up on a rocky mesa. From their hiding place, they watched the 5 men ride into the canyon below them. They were coarse, loud men, their voices carrying in the clear air. They spoke of the reward, of what they would do with the money, and of her. The words they used were ugly, reducing her to a prize to be taken and used. Nell felt a wave of sickness. She looked at Kane. He was watching the men with a predator's stillness, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. But he made no move. To fight them would be to announce their position. His way was not to conquer the obstacle, but to flow around it, to let it defeat itself. He would not kill for her. He would simply outwit them. And as they watched the bounty hunters ride on, following a false trail into a waterless box canyon, Nell understood that his intelligence was a far more formidable weapon than any gun. That evening, as they shared another meager meal, the silence between them felt different. It was no longer purely hostile on her part. It was laced with a reluctant curiosity. She wanted to understand the workings of his mind, to know how he read this land so perfectly. "What is your name?" she asked abruptly. He looked up from the piece of jerky he was chewing. "They call me Kane. And what does your real name mean, the one they do not use?" He was silent for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. He had noticed it before, in the station yard. She had faced down Creed soldiers. In the desert, she met the brutal sun and the punishing landscape without flinching. She looked at him now, her gaze direct and unwavering, stripped of Boston artifice. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, did not look away. "Tli nidisni," he said, the syllables strange and soft in the desert night. "What does it mean?" she whispered. "It means, she who does not look away." The name settled over her, not as a label, but as an observation, a recognition. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt seen, not as a contract or a prize, but as a person with a quality he had deemed worthy of a name. A seed of something new and fragile took root in the barren ground of her despair. A few days later, during a difficult climb, Kane's hand slipped on a loose rock. He caught himself, but a sharp shard of granite laid open a long, deep gash across the back of his hand and wrist. He wrapped it grimly with a strip of cloth, but in the heat and filth, she could see it was already becoming inflamed. That night, she watched him try to clean it with water and a pained grimace. From a deep pocket in her torn dress, she retrieved the one small remnant of her old life she had managed to keep with her sewing kit. It was a small leather roll containing needles, a thimble, and spools of silk thread. She opened it and approached him. He watched her, his eyes full of suspicion as she held up a needle. "Let me," she said, "it will fester if you do not close it." He hesitated, his pride and his mistrust warring on his face. She took a scrap of her ruined petticoat, threaded the needle, and made a few neat, precise stitches in the cloth to show him. He watched her steady hands, then looked at his own mangled one. He gave a curt, reluctant nod. She worked carefully, cleaning the wound as best she could with their limited water before drawing the edges of the skin together. Her touch was professional, detached. He sat rigid, not making a sound as the needle pierced his skin again and again. It was another strange intimacy, a reversal of their roles. Here, in this one small thing, she was the one with the skill, the one in control. When she was done, a line of tiny, perfect black stitches held the wound closed. He looked at the hand, flexing his fingers. It was the work of a skilled seamstress applied to human flesh. He said nothing for a long time. The fire crackled. The stars, huge and brilliant in the black sky, looked close enough to touch. "In Boston," he said finally, his voice low. "A woman belongs to her father, then her husband." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "Yes," Nell said, her throat tight. "That is not our way. A person can belong with the people, belong with the land. A husband and a wife. They belong with each other." He held up his uninjured hand, his fingers spread, like this, each their own. He then slowly intertwined the fingers of both his hands. But they grow together. They make a shelter for each other. One does not own the other. The simple words fell into the deep well of her confusion and despair, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of light, belonging with, not belonging to. It was a revolutionary idea, a concept so foreign to her entire upbringing that it staggered her. She looked from her handiwork on his skin to his face, shadowed by the firelight, the dust of the trail, the ash from the storm, the water from his skin. All of it had been a kind of baptism. The Eleanor Hartley who had been sold for copyrights was being scoured away, layer by layer. In her place, someone new was emerging, someone who did not look away. The entrance to the hidden village was a crack in the world. Kane led her through a narrow, winding passage between sheer rock walls that eventually opened into a wide, sunlit canyon. It was a place sheltered from the wind and hidden from any casual eye. Woven grass and brush dwellings, wickiups, were scattered amongst the boulders and ancient juniper trees. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting agave, and the clean scent of pine. Women looked up from their work, their hands stilling on their baskets and looms, their dark eyes following Nell with a silent, intense scrutiny. Children, who had been laughing and chasing a dog, fell quiet and hid behind their mothers. This was not a fortress, but a home, a temporary, precarious one. The weight of their collective gaze was heavier than the desert sun. She was an outsider, a white woman, the physical embodiment of the world that was relentlessly trying to crush them. She felt her otherness like a brand, a woman with a face remarkably like Kane's, but etched with sharper lines of worry, approached them. She was wiping her hands on a leather apron, Her eyes flickered from Kane's stitched hand to Nell's face, and her expression was a wall of hard, protective suspicion. "This is Sani, my sister," Kane said. Sani spoke to him in their language, her tone rapid and questioning. She gestured toward Nell with her chin, the meaning clear. "What is this? Why is she here?" Kane replied in a low, even voice. He did not seem to be explaining so much as stating a fact that could not be changed. Sani's lips thinned, but she did not argue. She looked at Nell again, and this time her gaze lingered on the tattered remains of her dress and her bruised, scratched feet. There was no welcome in her eyes, but perhaps a flicker of something else, a grudging acknowledgement of the ordeal she had clearly endured. From the largest of the wickiups, another woman emerged, moving slowly with the aid of a walking stick. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, her white hair braided with strips of turquoise cloth. Her eyes, however, were sharp and clear, missing nothing. This was their grandmother, White Shell. She did not speak. She simply looked at Nell, her gaze holding a century of wisdom and sorrow. It was a look that stripped away all pretense, all identity, and saw only the spirit within. Nell found she could not hold that gaze for long. She looked down, ashamed of her intrusion. Her very existence a complication these people did not need. In the days that followed, Nell learned the language of silence. No one spoke to her, but she was watched constantly. She was given a place to sleep in a small, empty wickiup, a blanket, and a share of the food. It was a cold, formal hospitality that kept her at a distance. The knot of anger and fear in her stomach began to transform into a profound and aching loneliness. She saw how little they had. Water was hauled in skins from a deep, hidden spring. Food was what the hunters brought in and what the women could gather roots. Nuts, the occasional rabbit. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of leather, every sinew, every broken pot had a purpose. And she, with her useless hands and her Boston education, was a burden. The change began with a small thing. A child, no more than 4 years old, was crying from thirst, his mother busy grinding mesquite beans. Nell, remembering the discipline Kane had taught her, had a small amount of water left in the gourd she had been given for the day. Without thinking, she knelt and offered it to the boy. He drank greedily. His mother saw the gesture. She said nothing, but the next morning, Nell found a small, sweet, prickly pear fruit left outside her dwelling. Her sewing kit became her second voice. A boy tore his shirt while practicing with his bow. His mother was about to mend it with a clumsy bone awl and sinew. Nell retrieved her fine steel needle and silk thread. She took the shirt and, with the quick, efficient stitches her governess had taught her, repaired the tear so neatly it was almost invisible. Sani watched her, her arms crossed. She examined the repair, running a finger over the fine stitches. She still did not smile, but the hard wall in her eyes seemed to develop a small crack. The outside world intruded a few weeks later. A scout, a young man with a grim face, returned from a trip to the agency at San Carlos. He brought news. Captain Creed was making good on his threat. He had convinced the Indian agent, a man in the pocket of Horace Bell, to cut their people's rations. The official story, whispered among the reservation police, was that the Chiricahua were being punished for raiding. The truth was, it was a deliberate, calculated act of starvation, designed to force the last free bands out of their mountain strongholds and onto the reservation, clearing the way for Bell's railroad. And there was more. The Reverend Abel Pritchard was traveling between the military forts and the new mining towns, preaching a sermon of peace. He spoke of a brave young woman from Boston, a Miss Eleanor Hartley, who had given herself as a bride to the Apache to seal a new era of harmony. He was painting her as a willing sacrifice, a saint of the frontier, a narrative that turned her kidnapping into a noble act and Kane's people into grateful recipients of civilization's charity. The lie was so monstrous, so perversely twisted, that it made Nell physically ill. They were using her name, her story, to sanctify the theft of a valley. The news settled a heavy gloom over the village. That evening, there was a funeral. An old man, weakened by hunger and the hard journey, had died in his sleep. Nell watched from a distance as the community gathered. There was no sermon, no coffin. The family wailed. A raw, open expression of grief that was both shocking and deeply moving to a girl raised in the stoic restraint of New England. They spoke of the old man's life, his deeds, the children he had raised, the mountains he had known. They buried him with his few possessions in a deep crevice, sealing it with rocks to protect him. As she watched, Nell began to understand. This was not the first funeral, nor would it be the last. The grief in the camp was not just for this one old man. It was a collective wound, a sorrow for a whole way of life that was being systematically destroyed. She saw the faces of the women, the quiet dignity of the men, and realized they were mourning for their children's future, for the mountains they were being driven from, for the graves of their ancestors they were being forced to leave behind. Her own predicament, which had seemed the center of the universe, suddenly felt small in the face of such profound, communal loss. The next day, Cain found her sitting by the small creek that ran through the canyon. He had been gone for 2 days, scouting the high passes. He came and sat beside her, not too close, but sharing the same patch of shade. "You are quiet," he said. "I saw the burial." He nodded, his face grim. "We have had too many of them." She felt a knot of guilt and confusion in her throat. "My guardian, the Reverend, they sold me. I was supposed to be a bride of peace, a part of some contract. But now the Reverend is using my name to help them take your land. It is all a lie. I am part of that lie. The honor of my name is being used for a crime." Her honor. The word sounded hollow and absurd out here. What did honor mean when people were starving? What was a signed contract against the law of the mountains? Cain looked at her, his expression softening for a moment. "Your name is not the lie. Pritchard is the lie. Bell is the lie. Honor is not what is written on a piece of paper in a city you will never see again. Honor is feeding a child who is thirsty. It is mending a shirt for a boy who has nothing else." His words cut through her confusion. He had seen her small acts. He had understood. He was telling her that her worth was not in her name or her past, but in what she did, here and now. The conflict inside her. The struggle between the consigned bride she was supposed to be and the person she was becoming, shifted. For the first time, she felt a flicker of true agency, of self. To distract her, or perhaps himself, he decided it was time she'd learn to ride properly. He brought her a quiet mare, a stocky, intelligent animal. There was no fine leather saddle, only a simple blanket cinched with a leather strap. "Forget everything you know," he told her as she tried to mount with the awkward formality of a side saddle. "You ride with your legs, with your balance. You become part of the horse." It was a disaster. She was clumsy, stiff, her body accustomed to being a passenger, not a participant. She held the single rein of rope in a white-knuckled grip, trying to steer the horse like a Boston carriage. The mare, sensing her fear and uncertainty, simply stood still, occasionally twitching an ear in annoyance. Cain watched, a rare glint of amusement in his eyes. "The horse listens to your heart, not the reins," he teased. "My heart is hammering against my ribs," she retorted. "Breathless and frustrated, the horse must think it has gone mad." He laughed. It was not a loud sound, but a low, warm rumble in his chest that surprised them both. "Let go," he said, his voice gentler now. "Do not fight it. Feel the way she moves." He came and stood by the mare's head, speaking to it in soft, crooning tones. Then he put his hand on Nell's knee. "Trust the horse. Trust yourself." His touch was steadying. She forced herself to relax, to loosen her death grip on the rein. She focused on the rhythm of the horse's breathing, on the subtle shifts of the muscles beneath her. Slowly, tentatively. The mare began to walk. It was not a graceful performance, but it was a start. It was a moment of lightness, a brief respite from the heavy weight of their reality, and it forged another, stronger link in the strange chain that bound them. The respite was short-lived. The scouts brought worse news. A cavalry patrol was making a detailed survey of the Dragoon Mountains, mapping the trails, the waterholes, the very ghost trails Kane had used to bring her here. They were preparing for a final sweep, a military action to drive the last of the people out. Kane's band needed to move, to retreat deeper into the mountains, to a place they called Dos Rios, the Valley of Two Rivers, but the patrol was blocking the safest route. They gathered around the fire that night, the elders and the warriors, their faces grim. They spoke of ambushing the patrol, but they were outnumbered and low on ammunition. A direct fight would be suicide. Nell listened, her mind racing. She thought of the telegraph poles marching across the desert, of that strange, humming wire. She thought of the station, the clattering sound of the telegraph key, a sound she knew well from the main post office in Boston. "The wire," she said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. "The telegraph wire. Where does it run?" Kane pointed north. "It follows the main trail toward Fort Thomas. There is a small relay station 20 miles from here." "Why?" "The soldiers," she said, thinking aloud. "They get their orders by telegraph, do they not? A patrol would have a schedule. Orders can be changed." Sani looked at her with scorn. "We are not soldiers. We cannot send a telegraph." "No," Nell said, her idea taking shape, her voice growing stronger. "But I know how they write their messages. The phrasing, the abbreviations. If I could write a message, and someone could get it to the operator at the relay station, tell him it came down the line from Fort Bowie." It was a wild, desperate gamble. It would require a scout to ride for a day, to approach a white settlement without being seen, and to somehow pass a written message to a telegraph operator. But it was better than no plan at all. Kane stared at her, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. He saw not a captive, not a white woman, but a mind at work, a spirit that did not look away from a fight. He was a warrior, a strategist, and he recognized the daring of her plan. He saw the risk, but he also saw the beautiful, unlikely possibility of its success. He turned to the council. He spoke in their language, his voice carrying a new weight. Nell could not understand the words, but she understood the tone. He was convincing them. He was trusting her. Later, he came to her wiki-up. He brought a precious, smooth piece of bark and a stick of charcoal. "Write it," he said. Her hand trembled as she took the charcoal. The fate of these people, her own fate, rested on her ability to craft a believable lie. She thought for a moment, then began to write. Her Boston education, the one thing she had thought was useless in this savage land, becoming her most potent weapon. Patrol Baker 7. New intel. Hostile activity reported vicinity Dos Cabezas. Proceed immediately to intercept. Urgent. Confirm. Captain S. Creed. It was short, authoritative, and it sent the patrol in the opposite direction of the valley they needed to reach. She handed the bark to Kane. He read it, a slow smile spreading across his face. "She who does not look away," he said softly. "You have sharp eyes and a sharp mind." A young warrior took the message and slipped away into the night. Now, all they could do was wait. Nell lay awake in her wiki-up, listening to the sounds of the canyon. She was no longer just a consigned bride. She was a conspirator, a forger, an ally. She had chosen a side. She had chosen to belong with... The scout returned with good news. The false telegraph message had worked like a charm. The cavalry patrol had been diverted, chasing phantoms in the Dos Cabezas mountains, leaving the way south to Dos Rios clear. But the victory was a temporary one. They were desperately low on salt to preserve what little meat they had, and their supply of medicinal herbs was depleted. The nearest place to get what they needed was a new, ugly town that had sprung up around Horace Bell's railroad construction camp, a place called Terminus. It was a viper's nest, but they had no choice. Kane decided he and Nell would go. He could pass as a Mexican vaquero looking for work, and Nell, with her hair hidden under a wide-brimmed sunbonnet and her body clad in a shapeless, faded calico dress borrowed from Sani, could be his quiet wife. Her skin was now tanned by the sun, her hands calloused. The soft Boston lady was gone, replaced by a tougher, leaner woman of the territory. The disguise was better than she knew. Terminus was a scar on the landscape. It was a raw, chaotic collection of tents, raw lumber shacks, and one long, dusty street. The air, thick with sawdust and coal smoke, rang with the ceaseless clang of hammers on steel rails. The rhythmic pounding was the heartbeat of the town, a relentless, driving sound that spoke of a world being torn apart and remade by force. A steam engine sat hissing on a half-finished siding, a monstrous iron beast waiting to devour the valley. The railroad tracks themselves stretched out across the flats, two gleaming lines of steel that cut through the ancient land like a wound that would not heal. They left their horse on the outskirts and walked into the maelstrom. Men of all races and nations thronged the street Irishmen with sunburnt necks, Chinese laborers in loose blue cotton, silent and watchful, Mexican families seeking work, and a hard-faced assortment of gamblers, buffalo hunters, and former soldiers. It was a town with no past, only a brutal, acquisitive present. Nell kept her head down, her bonnet hiding her face, and stayed close to Kane's side. He moved through the crowd with a quiet confidence that was its own form of invisibility, his eyes constantly scanning, missing nothing. Their destination was the sprawling canvas and wood structure that served as the company store and saloon. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and bulk goods, coffee, flour, and bacon. They moved to the back, where barrels of supplies were stacked, while Kane quietly negotiated with the clerk for salt and flour, paying with a few small, intricately beaded items Sani had made. Nell browsed the shelves, looking for quinine and bandages. Then she heard a voice that made the blood freeze in her veins. It was the oily, pious tone of the Reverend Abel Pritchard. A true blessing, is it not, he was saying to a burly, sweat-stained man who looked like a foreman. The Lord works in mysterious ways. This union will bring peace and prosperity to this entire valley. The savages see the wisdom of it. Nell flattened herself behind a tall stack of flour sacks, her heart pounding. The foreman grunted, taking a swig from a flask. I do not care about the Lord's ways. Pritchard, I care about Mr. Bell's schedule. We need to be laying track through the San Pedro Valley by next month. When is this ceremony happening? Soon, my friend. Very soon, Pritchard said, his voice oozing confidence. The contract is signed. The bride, Miss Hartley, is already with the people, a testament to our good faith. All that remains is the formal exchange with Chief Redknife, a small formality. And then Mr. Bell's land grant is secured, and the army will have its justification to clear out any remaining hostiles. Nell pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She risked a peek around the sacks. Pritchard was beaming, his face a mask of holy benevolence. Redknife, the foreman scoffed. I heard he is so old and sick he cannot stand up. What is he going to do with a young white woman? It is a political marriage, my good man, not one of passion, Pritchard said smoothly. It satisfies the letter of the law, and that is all that matters. The pieces slammed together in Nell's mind with the force of a physical blow. A different chief, a fraudulent contract. The station hand at Sulphur Springs had not just mislabeled her trunk, he had switched her entire identity, handing her bill of lading and her very person over to the wrong party. Her intended contract, the one her guardian had signed, must have been with this Chief Redknife. Kane had intervened to save Chayton, and in the chaos, because of a dropped scarf and a clerk's drunken error, He had taken the wrong bride. The whole terrible chain of events, the chase, the hiding, her entire ordeal, had been born of a simple, stupid mistake. And Horace Bell, Creed, and Pritchard were now building a war on that foundation of lies. If they held this sham ceremony, this delivery of a bride who was not even there, Bell would get his railroad, and Creed would get his war. Kane finished his transaction and moved silently to her side. He had heard it too. His face was a thundercloud. He knew Red Knife, an elder of a different band, a man respected for his wisdom, now being used as a pawn in his dotage. Kane took her arm and steered her out of the store into the blinding sunlight and noise of the street. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low and tight with a cold fury she had never seen in him before. They started back down the street, their mission now a desperate flight. But as they passed a makeshift structure of raw pine that had a crudely painted cross on it, a church still smelling of sap, they saw a sight that stopped them in their tracks. A government agent, a weasel-faced man in a dusty suit, was herding two small Apache boys, no older than 8 or 9, toward a wagon. The boys were terrified. They were trying to pull away, their bare feet digging into the dusty street. "Boarding school," Kane breathed, the words like a curse. Nell had heard of them, places where they took native children, cut their hair, beat their language out of them, and tried to turn them into white people. The agent jerked one of the boys by the arm, and as he did, the child's loose shirt pulled up, revealing a pattern of dark, angry welts across his back. The agent shoved him toward the wagon. "Leave it, Nell," Kane said, his hand tightening on her arm. "We cannot—" But the smaller of the two boys, seeing his chance, suddenly bit the agent's hand and darted away, straight into the chaotic street. The agent swore and lunged after him, leaving the other boy standing alone for a single, unguarded second. In that second, Kane moved. He did not run. He simply flowed through the crowd, a shadow detaching itself from the background. He reached the boy, murmured something in his language, and in one smooth motion, scooped him up and turned into the narrow, dark alley between the church and the saloon. It happened so fast that by the time the agent had caught the first boy and turned back, the second was simply gone. The agent looked around, his face a mask of confusion and fury, but Kane had vanished. Nell's heart was in her throat. She followed, her own movements now driven by a desperate instinct. She found Kane and the boy huddled behind a stack of empty whiskey barrels at the back of the alley. The boy was shaking, his eyes huge with fear. A moment later, the second boy, having wriggled free again in the confusion, found his way to them, drawn by some unseen signal from Kane. "We cannot take them with us," Nell whispered, her mind racing. "They will slow us down. They will be seen." "I will not leave them," Kane said, his voice flat and final. As they crouched there, the sounds of the town swirling around them, a new sound intruded. A man with a large, boxy camera on a tripod was setting up shop at the mouth of the alley. He had a painted canvas backdrop of a grand waterfall, a comical absurdity in this dry, dusty world. A traveling photographer, offering portraits to the miners and merchants. Nell looked at the photographer, then at the older boy, who had now pulled his torn shirt off in the heat. The marks on his back were stark and undeniable. An idea, as desperate and brilliant as the forged telegraph, ignited in her mind. "Proof," she whispered. "We need proof." She took the few coins she had left and approached the photographer. My brothers," she said, her voice catching. "We wish to have a likeness made to send to our mother." The photographer, a man with ink stains on his fingers and a bored expression, shrugged. "1 photograph, 2 bits. She led the boys out of the shadows. They were terrified, but Kane spoke to them in a low, soothing voice, and they allowed Nell to position them in front of the ridiculous waterfall. "Sit here," she told the older boy, turning him so that his back was slightly angled toward the camera. "Your brother will stand behind you, with his hand on your shoulder." It was a natural pose, brotherly and protective, but it left the brutal evidence of the agent's cruelty clearly visible to the camera's unblinking glass eye. The photographer ducked under his black cloth. There was a bright, disorienting flash of magnesium powder and a puff of smoke. The man disappeared into a small, light-proof tent to prepare the wet glass plate. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The agent could reappear at any moment. Kane stood at the mouth of the alley, a silent, watchful guardian. Finally, the photographer emerged, holding a glistening glass plate. The image was there, a ghostly negative of the two boys, the waterfall, and the terrible marks, a truth captured in silver and collodion. Nell paid the man, wrapping the still damp plate in a piece of cloth. "Now," Kane said. He led them away, not back through the main street, but through a maze of back alleys and refuse heaps. He found the two boys a place of temporary safety with a Mexican family he knew from his trading days. A family who owed him a debt and who hated the government agents as much as he did. He promised he would come back for them. As they slipped out of Terminus, the sun setting behind them, the sound of the hammers on steel faded. Nell clutched the glass plate to her chest. It was cold and hard, a fragile rectangle of truth. She had come to this town for salt and medicine, supplies for the body. She was leaving with something far more dangerous and far more valuable, a photograph that could expose a lie, and the full, staggering knowledge of the conspiracy that had stolen her life and now threatened to destroy an entire people. The railroad tracks gleamed in the last light, a promise of steel that Horace Bell had made to the world. But she now held a promise of her own, one made of glass and light, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would find a way to make it heard. The flight from Terminus was a desperate, scrambling retreat. They pushed their horse hard through the twilight, the precious, fragile glass plate wrapped in saddle padding and tucked deep into a leather pouch. Behind them, they knew, the alarm would be raised. Horace Bell was not a man to lose a pawn and two potential laborers without a response. For 2 days they traveled without rest, following the high, hidden trails. Kane's knowledge of the land their only shield, but their pursuers were relentless. On the 3rd day, a party of Bell's hired guns, men with the hard, empty eyes of wolves, picked up their trail. The chase was a nightmare of rock and thorns. They abandoned their horse, which could not manage the treacherous ascent Kane chose, and continued on foot. A shot, fired from a long rifle from the canyon floor below, kicked up a spray of granite chips near Kane's head. Another whined past Nell's shoulder. They were not trying to kill them, she realized with a cold horror. They were trying to wound them, to cripple them, to make them easier to take. As they scrambled over a jagged ridge of basalt, a bullet ricocheted off the rock face. Kane cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, and stumbled. He caught himself, but when he straightened, Nell saw a dark stain spreading across the buckskin on his right hip. He ignored it, pulling her along, his face a grim mask of pain and determination. They pressed on, adrenaline and fear numbing their exhaustion. The sky, which for weeks had been a merciless, empty blue, was changing. Great bruised-looking clouds were building in the south, their bellies dark with moisture. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an electric tension that mirrored the frantic beating of Nell's own heart. The first drops of rain, fat and warm, splattered in the dust around them, each one leaving a small, dark crater. The monsoon had arrived. "Find shelter," Kane gasped, his breathing now ragged. The rain, a drizzle at first, intensified with astonishing speed, becoming a torrential, blinding downpour. The world dissolved into a gray, roaring sheet of water. The dry arroyos below them began to hiss and then roar as flash floods, thick with red mud and debris, tore down the canyons. The storm that had saved them by washing away their tracks now threatened to kill them. Kane spotted it, a dark slash in the rock face, a shallow cave or overhang eroded from the cliff by centuries of wind and water. He half dragged, half carried Nell toward it. his injured leg now dragging badly. They collapsed into the relative dryness of the shelter just as the full fury of the storm broke. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, followed instantly by claps of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. The cave was not deep, but it was dry. A natural pool, a tinaja, had formed in a hollow of the rock floor, and it was already beginning to fill with water streaming down the cliff face. Kane slumped against the back wall, his eyes closing for a moment in sheer exhaustion and pain. Nell, her body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable shivering, crawled to the mouth of the cave. She watched the storm, mesmerized by its terrifying beauty. The desert, so recently a landscape of baked earth and rock, was alive with water. Waterfalls pouring over every ledge, the air filled with the clean, sharp scent of rain on dry soil and creosote bush. When she turned back, Kane was trying to tend to his wound. He had cut away the blood-soaked buckskin. The gash was deep and bleeding sluggishly. Her shivering intensified. It was not just the cold and the wet. A fever, born of exhaustion and terror, was taking hold of her, making her teeth chatter and her thoughts blur. "You need a fire," he said, his voice strained. She could only nod, wrapping her arms around herself. Despite the pain, he managed to gather a few pieces of dry wood from the very back of the cave and, using a flint and steel from his pouch, painstakingly coaxed a tiny flame to life. He nurtured it carefully, feeding it slivers of wood until it grew into a small but steady fire. The flames pushed back the damp chill and cast flickering, dancing shadows on the rock walls. The light reflected in the growing pool of the tinaja, making it seem as if fire and water were meeting in their small sanctuary. "Come," he said, "near the fire." She crawled closer. Huddling in a blanket he pulled from his pack, but she could not get warm. The fever was in her bones. She watched as he tried to clean his wound with a wet cloth, his face pale and slick with sweat in the firelight. "Let me," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. She took the cloth from him. Her hands were shaking, but her training, the memory of her neat stitches on his hand, took over. The wound was too deep for stitches, but she cleaned it as best she could, her touch gentle. He endured her ministrations in silence, his jaw tight. When she was done, she packed it with the last of the medicinal herbs from their pouch and bound it tightly with a strip of cloth torn from her own petticoat. She sat back on her heels, a wave of dizziness washing over her. The fire, the enclosed space, the rhythmic drumming of the rain outside. All of it seemed to dissolve the barriers between them. They were no longer captor and captive, Apache warrior and Boston lady. They were just two people, wounded and feverish, sheltering together from a storm. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the stoic, unreadable man of the trail, but a person exhausted and in pain. And she saw in his eyes a reflection of her own weariness, her own fear, the whole impossible tangled story of their meeting, the lies and the mistakes, rose up in her throat. Her teeth chattered, and she spoke through them, the words coming out in ragged breaths. "At 18, I was sent west to marry an Apache chief." The words hung in the warm, humid air of the cave. It was the title of a story she no longer recognized as her own, a life that had been promised to her, then stolen. It was the beginning of everything, the source of all this pain and chaos. Kane's dark eyes fixed on her. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face, making his expression impossible to read. He was silent for a long moment, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the steady roar of the rain. Then he reached out, not to touch her, but as if to hold the space between them. His voice was low, rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "But I claimed you by mistake," he said, "and I will never let you go." The confession and the vow, delivered in a single breath. The truth, finally spoken aloud in the heart of the storm. He had taken her by accident, an error built on a lie. The knowledge was not a shock. She had known it since Terminus, But hearing him say it, hearing the weight of that mistake in his own voice, changed everything. It was an apology, an explanation, and an absolution all at once. It severed the last chain of her old life, the last shred of the contract that had defined her. She was not a consigned bride. She was an accident, and in that there was a strange and profound freedom. But it was the second part of his sentence that shattered the last of her defenses. "And I will never let you go." It was not the threat of a captor. She heard no hint of ownership in his tone. It was a promise, a declaration. It was the voice of a man making a choice, forging a new truth in the wreckage of the old one. He had claimed her by mistake, but he would keep her by choice. The fever, the exhaustion, the terror of the past days finally broke her. A single tear traced a path through the dust and grime on her cheek. Then another. She did not sob. She simply wept. Silent tears of grief for the girl she had been, of fear for the woman she was becoming, and of a strange, terrifying relief. He did not move to comfort her. He did not offer empty words. He simply sat with her in her sorrow, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in the storm. He let her grieve for the world she had lost, implicitly understanding that she had to before she could fully turn to face the new one she had found. When her tears subsided, a quiet peace settled in the cave. The law of the outside world, the world of contracts and treaties and lies, had no power here. Here, there was only the fire, the water, and the truth. "We will make our own law, you and I," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He nodded slowly. "No papers, no priests. We will respect the names we give each other. We will not force the future. We will belong with each other." It was an oath, sealed not with a ring or a book, but with shared hardship and a spoken truth. The captivity was over. What lay ahead was a partnership, a bond forged by choice in the heart of the wilderness. They were startled by a sound from the mouth of the cave, a low whistle that cut through the sound of the rain. A figure, drenched and dripping, stood silhouetted against the gray curtain of the storm. It was one of Cain's scouts, a young man named Taza. He had followed them, his tracking skills as sharp as Cain's own. He came forward, his eyes wide as he took in the scene, the fire, Cain's bound hip, Nell's feverish face. He spoke in rapid Apache, his message urgent. Cain's expression hardened as he listened. "What is it?" Nell asked, a new dread coiling in her stomach. He turned to her. The brief peace of their sanctuary shattered. "The news from Terminus has reached Captain Creed. Pritchard is with him. They are moving the timeline up. They are preparing a ceremony at the fort in 2 days. A formal delivery of the bride, Eleanor Hartley, to Chief Red Knife, to finalize the treaty. They will not wait for a bride to appear," Taza added in halting English. "They will say you are already with us. The ceremony is for the papers, for the soldiers." It was a trap, designed to be sprung whether she was there or not. They would use her name to sign away the valley, and then use her absence as the final excuse to declare war, to launch the sweep that would drive Cain's people from their homes forever. Cain looked from the scout to Nell, and his hand instinctively went to the leather pouch at his side, the pouch that held the cold, hard rectangle of glass. The law of the fire and the rain was not enough. To survive, they would have to fight the white man's world with its own weapons. They would have to fight with the law. The journey to Tombstone was a fever dream. Taza, the scout, found a reclusive prospector who, for the price of a small, perfect piece of turquoise, agreed to take them in his rickety wagon. Cain lay in the back, his wound tightly bound, his body rigid with a pain he refused to name. The jolting of the wagon was a constant agony. Nell's own fever had broken in the cool aftermath of the storm, leaving her weak and hollowed out, but with a strange, chilling clarity of purpose. She clutched the glass plate, wrapped in every piece of soft cloth she owned, as if it were the last anchor in a hostile world. Taza had ridden ahead, a phantom in the night, carrying a message from Cain to a name he had been given, a contact in the raw, new mining town. They arrived at dawn, entering a city that seemed to be clawing its way into existence. Tombstone was a maelstrom of mud, sawdust, and raw ambition. Half-finished wooden buildings with grand false fronts stood shoulder to shoulder with canvas tents and smoky saloons from which the sounds of tinny pianos and rough laughter spilled out even in the early morning light. The whole town felt temporary, perched on the edge of a great mineral strike and a great deal of violence. They found their destination in a small adobe office tucked between a raucous saloon and a laundry run by Chinese immigrants. The simple wooden sign read, "Elizabeth Freeman, attorney at law." The woman who opened the door was not what Nell expected. She was young, perhaps only a few years older than Nell herself, and she was black. She was dressed in a severe but impeccably tailored traveling suit, and her hair was pinned in a neat, professional coil. Her eyes were intelligent, missing nothing as they took in Nell's ragged appearance and the exhausted, wounded man being helped from the wagon behind her. "You must be Miss Hartley," she said, her voice calm and clear. With no hint of surprise, Taza's message was compelling. "Please, come inside." Inside, the office was an oasis of order in the surrounding chaos. Books lined one wall. A neat desk stood in the center. Elizabeth Freeman listened to Nell's story without interruption. She listened to the tale of the sale, the switched identity, the kidnapping, the lies of Reverend Pritchard, and the fraudulent contract with the dying Chief Red Knife. Kane, sitting in a chair in the corner, his face pale, added a few quiet words in a low voice, confirming the details about Red Knife and the traditions being violated. When Nell finished, she carefully unwrapped the glass plate and set it on the desk. Elizabeth picked it up, holding it to the light from the window. She stared for a long time at the image of the two boys, at the unmistakable pattern of welts on the older boy's back. "This is not just evidence, Miss Hartley," she said softly. "This is a weapon. Horace Bell and Captain Creed believe their power is absolute out here. They believe the law is whatever they can enforce with a gun. We must show them it is something that can be written and read." She moved with a brisk, decisive energy. She explained that a territorial judge was in town, a rare and fortunate occurrence. She would file for an emergency hearing, an injunction to stop the fraudulent treaty ceremony. It was a long shot, she warned. The town was full of men who worked for Bell's railroad or hoped to profit from it. The prejudice against the Apache was a palpable thing, but it was a chance. The courtroom, located on the second floor of the new clapboard municipal building, was packed. It smelled of sweat, chewing tobacco, and wet wool. Miners in muddy boots sat next to merchants in dusty suits. Every face was turned toward Nell as she took her seat beside Elizabeth Freeman. They were hostile, curious, hungry for a spectacle. She saw Horace Bell near the front, his face a mask of smug confidence. Beside him, in a seat of honor, sat the Reverend Abel Pritchard, his hands steepled, the very picture of piety. At the back of the room, a line of blue-uniformed cavalrymen stood with their arms crossed. Captain Creed was making his presence known. The judge, a man named Spicer with a weary face and a flowing white mustache, banged his gavel for order. The sound was thin and reedy in the charged atmosphere. Elizabeth Freeman began, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. She spoke not of passion or injustice, but of contracts, jurisdictions, and fraud. She laid out the legal framework of the case with a precision that was both elegant and deadly. She presented the original marriage contract Nell had been forced to sign, a document she had carried sewn into the lining of her dress. "And now," she said, "I call Miss Eleanor Hartley." Nell walked to the witness stand, her legs unsteady. Every eye was on her. She took the oath, her voice a whisper. Elizabeth led her through the story, her questions gentle but firm. Nell spoke of Boston, of her guardian, of the journey west. She spoke of the chaos at Sulphur Springs Station, of the switched tags, of the scarf, of being taken by Cain. A lie. Horace Bell boomed from his seat. She went with the savage willingly, a fallen woman looking to excuse her shame. "Order!" Judge Spicer yelled, banging his gavel. "One more outburst, Mr. Bell, and I will have you removed." Pritchard stood up. "Your Honor, if I may, this poor misguided child has clearly been through a terrible ordeal. Her mind is confused. She has been held by these heathens for weeks. Who knows what they have done to her, what fantasies they have put in her head." "Reverend," Elizabeth said, her voice sharp as ice, "you will have your turn. Sit down." To Nell's astonishment, he did. "Now, Miss Hartley," Elizabeth continued calmly, "tell the court about Terminus. Tell them about the conversation you overheard." Nell recounted every word, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. She told them of the plan to use the sick and elderly Red Knife, of the plot to use the fake ceremony as a pretext for a military action. A low, angry murmur rippled through the courtroom. "And what else happened in Terminus?" Elizabeth asked. Nell looked at the 2 empty chairs Elizabeth had placed near their table. "We met 2 boys," she said, 2 Apache boys. They were being taken from their families. "Taken for their own good," Pritchard interjected. "For a Christian education." "Taken by force," Nell countered, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "And they were being harmed. I have proof." This was the moment. Elizabeth walked to the table and picked up the glass plate. She held it up for the judge, and then for the jury of 12 grim-faced men. "This likeness was taken in Terminus," she announced. "It shows the 2 boys in question. It was taken moments after they escaped from the government agent assigned to transport them. I draw your attention to the back of the older child." An usher took the plate and carried it along the jury box. Each man leaned forward, squinting at the image. Nell could see their expressions change. She saw hardened faces soften with a flicker of shock, of disgust. The welts were undeniable. The carefully constructed narrative of a peaceful, civilizing mission was cracking before their eyes. The judge studied the plate for a full minute, his face grim. Suddenly, a sound from outside shattered the tense silence in the courtroom. A gunshot, then another. A window pane high on the wall exploded, showering the floor with glass. People yelled and ducked. Judge Spicer hammered his gavel, his shouts for order completely lost in the noise. Through the window, Nell could see several of Bell's hired guns on horseback in the street below, rifles held aloft, their faces brazen and mocking. The law of the gun was making its argument. Before the chaos inside could subside, Captain Creed made his move. He strode to the front of the courtroom, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Your Honor," he announced, his voice ringing with military authority, "for the safety of the civilians, I am placing this courthouse and the surrounding area under military jurisdiction. My men will secure the perimeter. No one leaves until I give the order." It was not an offer of help. It was a power play. He was trapping them all, neutralizing the judge's authority under the guise of keeping the peace. Cain, who had been a statue of coiled tension in the corner, rose slowly to his feet. His eyes met Creed's across the room, a silent declaration of war. The judge, his face pale and furious, was about to object when the doors to the courtroom burst open again. It was not another gunman, but a boy, a young telegraph operator, his face flushed and his eyes wide with the importance of his message. "Telegram for Judge Spicer," he yelled, waving a yellow envelope. "Urgent, from Washington." The room fell silent. Even Creed seemed taken aback. The usher took the envelope and handed it to the judge. Spicer tore it open. He read it, then read it again, his eyebrows climbing his forehead. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over Horace Bell, Reverend Pritchard, and Captain Creed. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice holding a new, steely edge, "it seems the Bureau of Indian Affairs has opened a formal inquiry into the activities of our local agent, pending a review of certain land grants and government contracts in this territory." A collective gasp went through the room. It was a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Their web of local corruption was suddenly exposed to the light of federal scrutiny. Horace Bell's face, which had been smug and confident, turned a mottled shade of red and white. Pritchard looked as if he had been struck. Their power, which had seemed so absolute a moment ago, was suddenly fragile. Judge Spicer banged his gavel, and this time, the sound seemed to have weight, to have meaning. "This hearing is in recess," he declared. "I will have order. Captain Creed, your services will not be required. I want Mr. Bell's men off my street. Now." The spell was broken, but as people began to stir, to talk in excited, shocked whispers, Bell made his final, desperate move. He was a cornered animal, and he reverted to the only law he truly understood: brute force. He lunged forward, not toward the judge, but toward Nell. He was surprisingly fast for a man his size. He grabbed her arm in a brutal grip, pulling her from her chair before Kane or any of the court officers could react. "The contract is with me," he roared, his face contorted with rage. "She is the key." He began dragging her toward the door, using her body as a shield. One of his men, who had remained in the courtroom, drew a pistol, holding the crowd at bay. It was utter chaos. Elizabeth shouted. The judge bellowed, and Kane, with a roar of pure fury, launched himself forward, his wounded hip forgotten. But Bell was already out the door and clattering down the stairs. Nell caught a final glimpse of the courtroom, the overturned chairs, the shocked faces, the useless, silent gavel on the judge's bench. The law had tried to speak, but in the end, its voice had been drowned out by the simple, brutal act of a desperate man. She was a piece of property again, being dragged away from the one place where her words had mattered, back into the violent, lawless heart of the territory. The chaos of the street swallowed them. Horace Bell, his face a mask of primal fury, dragged Nell toward a horse held by one of his gunmen. She struggled, her feet scrabbling for purchase in the thick mud, but his grip was like iron. He threw her bodily into the saddle, swinging up behind her before she could even think of escape. The gunman fired another shot into the air, scattering the crowd, and they galloped out of Tombstone, a small, brutal cavalry of kidnappers. Inside the courthouse, the world had tilted on its axis. For a moment, Kane was frozen, his mind unable to process the sheer audacity of Bell's act. Then a cold, silent rage, deeper and more dangerous than any hot anger, settled over him. He was at the top of the stairs in 3 long strides, his injured hip screaming in protest. He saw them rounding the corner at the end of the street, vanishing in a cloud of dust and steam from a nearby laundry. He was too late. A hand on his arm stopped him. It was Elizabeth Freeman. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a cold fire of their own. "Do not go alone," she said, her voice low and intense. "You will be riding into a trap. Let the law handle this." He looked at her, then at the empty street. "The law," he said, his voice flat, "is in that man's saddlebag." Captain Creed was already barking orders, his men forming a cordon, not to pursue Bell, but to contain the scene, to control the narrative. The law, as it stood, was useless. But they were not alone, as if summoned by the crisis. Sani appeared at the bottom of the stairs, Taza at her side. She had come with a scout, sensing trouble, and her face was a mask of grim resolve. Behind her stood 2 men, Mexican vaqueros with quiet, steady eyes. They were the brothers whose family had sheltered the Apache boys. Their loyalty was not to the town or its laws, but to the man who had shown them respect. "We ride with you," the elder brother, Mateo, said simply. The 5 of them became an island of grim purpose in the confused swirl of the town. Elizabeth looked from Kane's resolute face to Sani's, and then at the 2 armed vaqueros. She was a woman of books and courtrooms, of logic and precedent. This was a world of tracking and violence. But Nell was her client, her responsibility. More than that, this had become her fight, too. "I am coming with you," she stated. It was not a request. Sanny looked her up and down, taking in the tailored suit and the impractical shoes. You will slow us down. I can ride, Elizabeth said, a line of steel in her voice. And when you find them, you will need a lawyer more than another gun. Kane looked at this strange, formidable woman and gave a single, sharp nod. The decision was made. They moved with a speed born of shared urgency, gathering horses and supplies, their small party a curious collection of Apache warriors, a black female lawyer, and Mexican cowboys, a living embodiment of the territory Bell and Creed sought to tame and divide. They followed the trail into a labyrinth of canyons and ridges, a violent upthrust of black volcanic rock known as the Serpent's Back. The monsoon, which had held its breath during the hearing, returned with a vengeance. A cold, driving rain began to fall, turning the narrow trails into treacherous ribbons of slick mud. It washed away the tracks, but Kane did not need them. He read the land itself, the broken twigs, the displaced stones, the direction of Bell's desperate flight. They were a silent, efficient team. They conserved their strength, shared their water from a single skin, and communicated with hand signals. When they stopped to rest, they built small, smokeless fires in hidden crevices. The knowledge of generations of survival passed down to Kane and Sanny. Elizabeth, to Sanny's surprise, was no burden. She was tireless, her resolve a palpable force. She learned to read the clouds, to listen to the wind, her sharp mind absorbing the lessons of this new, harsher courtroom. One afternoon, Kane used a small piece of polished silver from his pouch, a signal mirror, flashing a message to Taza, who was scouting a parallel ridge miles away, coordinating their search pattern with the silent pulses of light. Nell, meanwhile, was living in her own circle of hell. Bell and his men pushed her relentlessly, their initial confidence curdling into a grim, fearful haste as the storm worsened. They were led now by Captain Creed, who had shed his uniform and his pretense of legality, joining them on the trail with a few of his most loyal men. He had taken command, his military mind better suited to this brutal chase than Bell's panicked blustering. Nell was bound at the wrists, a rope leading from her saddle to Creed's. She was his prize, his key, and his leash was short. She rode in a state of numb terror, but beneath the fear, her mind was working. She watched everything, memorized the turns in the trail, noted the shape of the mountains. She listened to the clatter of the telegraph key in her memory, the rhythmic dots and dashes she had heard so often at the stations. She had paid attention, her mind bored during the long stagecoach journeys, soaking up the pattern of the sounds. She began to tap out the letters with her fingers against the pommel of her saddle. A silent, secret rebellion. D-A-S-H-D-O-T-D-O-T. The storm was their greatest enemy, and their greatest ally. A sudden landslide, a river of mud and rock, cascaded down a mountainside, forcing Creed's party to make a long, dangerous detour. Later, as they were making their way through a narrow canyon, a flash flood, a roaring wall of red water, erupted from a side channel, forcing them to scramble to high ground. They lost 2 of their pack horses, and with them, precious food and ammunition. The wildness of the land was fighting back. On the 5th day, as they rested their exhausted horses in a grove of skeletal, lightning-scarred pines, it happened. One of the hired guns, a man with a nervous tic and shifty eyes, suddenly stiffened, his gaze fixed on a high ledge of rock above them. A low, guttural cough echoed through the rain-soaked air. Nell saw it then, a long, tawny body, sleek with rain, moving with a liquid, predatory grace along the ledge. A mountain lion. It was huge, its powerful muscles bunched as it watched them, its yellow eyes glowing in the stormy twilight. The hired guns, men accustomed to the violence of saloons and back alleys, were unnerved. This was a different kind of danger, an ancient, elemental threat. One of the horses, smelling the predator, screamed and reared, its eyes rolling in terror. It broke its tether and bolted, crashing wildly through the undergrowth. The man with the tick raised his rifle with shaking hands and fired. The shot missed the cougar entirely, ricocheting off the rocks. The mountain lion, startled by the noise, let out a terrifying snarl and vanished from the ledge. The brief, chaotic encounter was all Kane's party needed. They had been closing the gap, and the panic caused by the cougar gave them their opening. They came not from the trail behind, but from the rocks above, appearing like ghosts in the mist. Taza, Mateo, and his brother Ricardo opened fire, their shots precise, aimed not to kill, but to disable, to drive their enemies from cover. Creed reacted with military instinct, shoving Nell behind a large boulder and returning fire. Bell, his face white with terror, simply huddled on the ground, useless. The fight was short and brutal. In the confusion, Nell saw her chance. The rope that bound her to Creed's saddle had come loose in the horse's earlier panic. She was still tied, but she was no longer anchored. She scrambled away, crawling behind another cluster of rocks as bullets whined overhead. Then there was only Kane and Creed. They faced each other on a narrow, slick shelf of basalt that jutted out over a sheer drop into the roaring, flood-swollen canyon below. The rain plastered their hair to their heads, and the wind tore at their clothes. "So the savage comes to fight for his stolen property," Creed sneered, raising his pistol. "This is all for a woman who was supposed to bring you peace, your little peace bride." Kane did not answer with words. He lunged, moving under the arc of the pistol. The gun went off, the shot going wild. He slammed into Creed, and the two men went down, grappling on the wet, treacherous rock. It was not a duel. It was a raw, desperate struggle. Creed was bigger, heavier, but Kane was quicker, fueled by a righteous fury. He was fighting on his home ground, the storm and the mountain, his allies. They rolled perilously close to the edge, the canyon yawning beneath them. Kane managed to get his knife free. He pressed the blade to Creed's throat. For a single, stretched moment, everything stopped. The wind, the rain, the shouts of the men below. Kane's face was a mask of cold fury. He had the power to end it, to send this man, this symbol of all the lies and the violence, into the abyss. The law of the mountain was simple, an eye for an eye. Nell watched, her heart in her throat. She saw the struggle in Kane's eyes, the war between the warrior he had been raised to be and the man he was choosing to become. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pulled the blade away. He did not kill him. Instead, he smashed his fist into Creed's jaw. The captain went limp. Kane stood up, breathing heavily, his injured hip throbbing. He took the rope from Creed's saddle and, with swift, efficient motions, bound the unconscious man's hands and feet. Elizabeth Freeman scrambled up the trail toward them, her face streaked with mud. She looked at the bound, defeated captain, then at Kane. "He belongs to the judge," Kane said, his voice rough. "Let his own law have him?" It was a victory more profound than any killing. It was a choice, a declaration that their fight was not for revenge, but for a justice that had not yet been born in this land. As Sani and the others rounded up the remaining hired guns, Nell found herself looking out from their high perch. The storm was beginning to break. A sliver of watery sunlight pierced the clouds, and far below, she saw it, a thin, straight line cutting across the valley floor, the railroad, and beside it, a tiny, solitary building with a single wire running to it, a telegraph relay station. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers closing on the small, silver button that had come loose from her ruined dress. It was polished and bright. She held it in the palm of her hand, angling it to catch the new, weak sunlight. Her mind raced. calling up the half-remembered patterns. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, S-O-S. She began to flash the button toward the distant station, a tiny, desperate pulse of light against the immense, wild landscape. She did not know if anyone would see it, if anyone would understand, but it was a signal, a call for the law that Kane had chosen not to abandon. It was her part of the fight, her voice in the wilderness. The tiny, rhythmic flash of Nell's silver button was a desperate prayer sent into the vast, storm-scoured landscape. For what felt like an eternity, there was no response but the sigh of the wind and the drip of water from the rocks. They were a small, weary band of victors on a lonely mountain, with a collection of dangerous prisoners and a long, treacherous road ahead. Kane, his face tight with pain, directed the binding of Bell and his remaining men, his authority quiet but absolute. Sonny, her initial suspicion of Elizabeth Freeman now replaced by a grudging respect, shared out the last of their dried meat. Then, Taza, his eyes fixed on the valley floor, let out a low hiss. A rider, a single rider, moving fast from the direction of Tombstone. Not a soldier, but a man in a dusty duster, a star glinting on his chest, a deputy marshal. Nell's signal had been seen. The telegraph operator, a young man with sharp eyes and a healthy fear of Judge Spicer, had done his duty. The law was riding to meet them. The journey down from the Serpent's Back was a slow, agonizing procession. The marshal, a taciturn man named Earp, deputized Mateo and Ricardo on the spot, and their grim efficiency kept the prisoners in line. Kane, leaning heavily on a sturdy branch, refused to be carried, his pride a harsh master. Every step sent a jolt of pain through his hip, but his focus was on the valley below, on the gleaming steel tracks of Horace Bell's railroad. Elizabeth Freeman rode beside the marshal, her legal mind translating the raw violence of the mountains into a language of affidavits and jurisdictions. By the time they reached the valley floor, she had a strategy. The marshal, acting on a wire from Judge Spicer, carried a warrant. It was not for kidnapping. Not yet. It was a warrant to search a specific freight car on a train belonging to the Southern Pacific Railroad, on suspicion of trafficking illegal armaments into the territory. The telegraph from Washington had given the judge the leverage he needed. Their destination was a half-finished bridge, a raw skeleton of timber trestles spanning a wide, sandy wash. A work train sat on the tracks, its locomotive hissing impatiently. A crew of laborers, a veritable tapestry of the dispossessed, was working under the hot sun. Chinese men, their long queues coiled around their heads, moved with a silent, rhythmic grace, their faces impassive. Irishmen, their skin burned raw, swung heavy mauls. A crew of black men, their muscles gleaming with sweat, hauled heavy timbers, their foreman a cruel-faced white man with a whip coiled at his belt. The arrival of the marshal's party brought the work to a halt. The foreman, loyal to Bell, moved to intercept them, their hands dropping to the pistols at their belts.
"This is railroad property," one of them snarled. "You have no business here."
Marshal Earp spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "I have a warrant from a territorial judge," he said, his voice deceptively mild. "We are going to inspect that closed boxcar." Horace Bell, his hands bound but his arrogance intact, struggled against his captors. "This is an outrage. You cannot stop the march of progress on the word of a savage and a hysterical woman." Elizabeth Freeman stepped forward, holding the warrant. "The law says we can—" "Mr. Bell." The standoff was tense, a powder keg waiting for a spark. The laborers watched, their faces blank but their eyes missing nothing. They were caught between their brutal bosses and this strange collection of intruders. Nell looked at their faces. She saw the exhaustion, the hopelessness, the quiet, simmering resentment. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of Kane's people in the hidden canyon. She understood that these men, who were laying the steel that would destroy a people, were prisoners too, trapped in a different kind of bondage. She walked forward, her voice clear and steady, not loud, but carrying in the sudden silence. "My name is Eleanor Hartley." She did not speak to the foreman or the marshal, but to the workers. "Mr. Bell," she said, gesturing to her captor, "promised me to a man I had never met in exchange for this land. He promised you a wage, a future." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Look at your hands. Look at your camps. Are his promises to you any truer than his promises to me?" A few men shifted, their eyes flicking from her to Bell, then to their own calloused hands. "They took 2 Apache boys from their family," she continued, her voice trembling slightly with the memory. "They said it was for their own good, just as they say this railroad is for the good of the territory." She held up the glass plate, its image catching the sun. "I have a picture of one of those boys. It shows the good they did to him with a whip." She did not need to show it to them. Her words were enough. She was not some distant, fine lady. She was one of them, a piece of property in a rich man's game. She had felt the whip in a different way, but she knew its sting. "We are asking you to stop," she said, "just for an hour, just to let the law do its work, to show Mr. Bell that men cannot be moved about like railroad ties." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the hissing of the steam engine. Then, one of the Chinese laborers, a man with a face like ancient parchment, straightened up and slowly, deliberately, set his hammer down on a wooden tie. The small, quiet thud was like a gunshot. Across the construction site, another hammer fell silent, then another. An Irish worker dropped his shovel. The black crew let a heavy timber fall to the ground. Within a minute, a profound and defiant silence had fallen over the work site. The only sound was the hissing of the engine. It was a strike, a quiet, powerful, non-violent rebellion. The foremen were stunned into inaction. Horace Bell, however, saw his empire of lies and coercion crumbling into dust before his eyes. His face went purple with a rage that was close to madness. With a sudden, explosive heave, he broke free from the stunned vaquero holding him.
"If I cannot have it, no one will!"
he screamed, his voice a raw shriek of fury. He scrambled toward a small shed where the dynamite for blasting rock was stored. One of his foremen, seeing his intent, created a diversion, drawing his pistol and firing into the air. In the ensuing chaos, Bell emerged from the shed, holding a stick of dynamite with a long, sputtering fuse. He ran onto the bridge. Kane, who had been leaning against a wagon, his face a gray mask of pain, moved with a speed that defied his injury. He was a blur of motion, a wounded wolf lunging to protect his pack. Bell reached the center of the trestle and jammed the dynamite into a crucial support joint. He was about to drop it when Kane tackled him. The 2 men went down hard on the raw planking of the bridge. The dynamite, its fuse still burning, fell from Bell's hand, rolling to a stop perilously close to the main support pillar. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then the sky opened. The rain, which had been threatening all day, came down in a solid gray wall. A low rumble from up the canyon became a deafening roar. A flash flood, a wall of brown, churning water, filled with uprooted trees and debris, was thundering down the dry wash. "The fuse!" Kane yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the approaching water. He pushed himself off Bell and crawled toward the sputtering dynamite. The flood hit the first of the bridge's timbers with the force of a battering ram. The entire structure shuddered. Nell screamed. Elizabeth and Sanny pulled workers back from the collapsing edge of the wash. The marshal and his deputies were trying to secure the prisoners, who were now screaming in terror. Kane reached the dynamite. The fuse was inches from the cap. With a final, desperate lunge, he severed it with his knife, just as the first great wave of water slammed into the pillar beneath him. The bridge groaned, timbers snapping. The boxcar, the one containing the evidence, tilted precariously. Several of the workers, who had been on the bridge, were thrown into the raging torrent. The climax of violence had instantly become a desperate struggle for survival.
Save them!
Kane shouted. He clung to the shuddering trestle, trying to reach a man being swept past. Mateo and Ricardo, ropes in hand, were already wading into the treacherous, thigh-deep water at the edge of the flood, trying to snag the struggling men. Sani, her face a mask of fierce concentration, directed them, pointing out survivors in the churning chaos. It was a nightmare of mud and water and splintering wood. They were no longer enemies. They were just people, fighting for their lives against the raw power of the land. Nell and Elizabeth helped pull a half-drowned Irish worker onto the bank. He coughed up a lungful of muddy water and looked at them with wide, shocked eyes. Horace Bell, his madness washed away by the terror of the flood, was pulled from the water by the very Chinese laborer who had started the strike. When the crest of the flood had passed, leaving behind a deep, swift-running river where there had been only sand, the scene was one of utter devastation. The bridge was a wreck, half of it washed away, but the boxcar, miraculously, had held wedged against the bank, and everyone was alive. Judge Spicer arrived an hour later, his buggy sloshing through the mud. He set up a makeshift court on the tailgate of a supply wagon. The drenched and muddy railroad ties, scattered along the bank, seemed like pews in this strange, open-air courtroom. The proceedings were swift. The boxcar was opened. It was filled with crates of new rifles and ammunition, illegally destined for a private army Bell was raising. With the testimony of the marshal, the evidence of the weapons, and Elizabeth Freeman's cold, precise legal arguments, the case was sealed. A telegraph was sent from the nearby station, its message clattering out into the world. Horace Bell was arrested for conspiracy, arms trafficking, and attempted mass murder. Captain Silas Creed, bound and delivered by Kane, was arrested for kidnapping, dereliction of duty, and conspiring against the authority of the United States government. And a warrant was issued for the Reverend Abel Pritchard for his part in the fraudulent contract and the embezzlement of federal funds intended for the Apache people. Nell stood beside Kane, his arm now slung over her shoulder for support. She looked at the wreckage. The railroad, the great engine of progress, had been stopped, at least for a day. The wet, muddy railroad ties, which had once seemed like a scar on the land, now looked different, washed clean by the flood. They lay like scattered lines of a story that had been twisted and bent, but which, at last, was finally being set straight. The trials of Horace Bell and Captain Creed were a 9-day sensation in the territorial courts. Elizabeth Freeman, with the evidence of the illegal arms and the irrefutable photograph, dismantled their defenses with a calm, surgical precision. Bell was convicted of a litany of crimes and sentenced to a long term in the federal prison at Yuma. Creed was court-martialed, stripped of his rank, and dishonorably discharged, his career ending in public disgrace. The Reverend Pritchard, apprehended while trying to flee to Mexico, was found to have a long history of defrauding not only the government, but his own church. Their web of greed and power, which had seemed so invincible, had been unraveled by a stolen bride, a stubborn lawyer, and the collective will of a few brave people. For Nell and Kane, the victory was a hollow one. The system had worked, but it had worked on its own terms. Judge Spicer, a man of the law, offered Nell safe passage back to Boston, a return to her rightful place in society. The new Indian agent, a bureaucrat sent from Washington to clean up the mess, offered Kane's people a place on the San Carlos reservation, with the promise of regular rations and government protection. They were offered 2 choices, 2 cages, one of lace and propriety, the other of government dependency. They refused them both. They chose instead a place Kane's people had long known, a place the maps had not yet claimed. It was a wide, fertile valley called Dos Rios, where 2 clear-running mountain streams met to form a larger river. It was a place of cottonwood trees and rich soil, sheltered by high canyon walls. It was here they decided to build their future, not as a hidden refuge, but as a new kind of settlement. News of the trial and the fall of Horace Bell traveled through the territory. The railroad's advance had stalled, its leadership in disarray. For a brief, hopeful moment, there was a vacuum of power, and into that vacuum came the people who had been pushed to the margins. Kane's band, led by Sanny and their grandmother White Shell, made the valley their home. They were soon joined by others. The two Vaquero brothers, Mateo and Ricardo, brought their families, tired of working for ranchers who paid them in scorn. A handful of the Chinese laborers, having been cheated of their wages one too many times, left the railroad camp and made the long walk to Dos Rios, bringing with them a knowledge of gardening and a quiet, unshakable resilience. A few black families, former soldiers and homesteaders who had been driven from their land, heard of this place where a man was judged by his hands and not his skin, and they came too. Dos Rios was not a town. It was a community, a fragile experiment in self-governance. They built their homes from adobe and wood, raised a common barn, and planted fields of corn, squash and beans along the riverbanks. They established a small clinic where Sani's knowledge of herbs and Nell's knowledge of sanitation and wound care worked side by side. There was no single leader. Decisions were made by a council of elders from each group, a slow and sometimes contentious process, but one that was built on mutual respect. At the heart of this new world was the school. It had no building. The classroom was a shaded grove of cottonwood trees by the river. The desks were smooth, flat stones, and its teachers were Nell and Kane. They called it the Bridge School, and its purpose was to arm the next generation with the tools they would need to survive in a world that was closing in on them. Nell taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. She used old newspapers and mail-order catalogs as textbooks, teaching the children the language of commerce and contracts. She showed them how to read a map, how to write a letter, how to understand the numbers in a ledger. These were not mere academic exercises. They were weapons. She was teaching them to see the architecture of the white man's power, so they would never again be cheated by a fraudulent document or a fast-talking agent. Kane taught other lessons. He took the children into the mountains and taught them the names of the plants, the habits of the animals, and the language of the clouds. He taught them how to find water, how to build a shelter, how to move through the land without leaving a trace. He taught them the Apache language, its stories and its history, ensuring that the soul of his people would not be erased. It was a curriculum of survival, a deep and practical knowledge that was as essential as reading and writing. The children, a boisterous mixed group of Apache, Mexican, and black youngsters, sat together under the trees, their minds stretching to hold two different worlds at once. They learned to calculate the cost of a barrel of flour in the morning and to track a deer in the afternoon. They learned the English alphabet and the Apache names for the stars. One hot afternoon, a small Apache girl with bright, curious eyes looked up from her slate and asked the question that hung in the air. "Are you the Peace Bride?" Nell, who was leaning over her shoulder to correct a sum, paused. The title, once a source of shame and confusion, now seemed like a relic from another lifetime. She smiled, a real, unburdened smile. "I am the bride of words," she said, tapping the girl's slate with her finger. "And words are very jealous. They demand you learn them properly." The peace they had found was a fragile one, and the outside world did not forget them for long. A letter arrived, carried by a mail rider from Tombstone. It was from a Boston law firm, her guardian's family, upon hearing of her scandalous life among the natives, was challenging her inheritance. They painted her as a fallen woman, mentally unsound, who had been corrupted by savages and had disgraced the Hartley name. They were petitioning the courts to have her declared incompetent, her inheritance to be passed to them, her more respectable relations. The poison of her old life had reached across the continent to find her. The inheritance was a substantial one. Money from her parents she had almost forgotten. It had never been real to her, but now it represented something vital, the future of their school, the ability to buy seed, tools, medicine, and books. She sat with Kane and Elizabeth Freeman, who had come to visit from her now thriving practice in Tombstone, and read them the letter. "They are trying to put you back in a box," Elizabeth said, her eyes flashing with anger. "The same box they put all women in who do not follow their rules." Kane looked at the letter, his face grim. "It is another kind of war," he said. "They fight with paper instead of guns." "We will fight back with paper," Elizabeth declared. She laid out a plan that was both simple and audacious. First, Nell would write a legal document, a deed of gift, formally and irrevocably donating her entire inheritance, should she receive it, to a trust established for the Dos Rios school. The money would belong not to her, but to the community. Second, to protect her from any further claims on her person or property, she and Kane would be legally married under the laws of the Arizona Territory. A marriage Nell was taken aback. The quiet, unspoken bond between her and Kane was deeper than any document. "A legal shield," Elizabeth explained. "As your husband, Kane would have legal standing to defend your interests. As a married woman, it becomes much harder for them to declare you incompetent. It makes you a part of a legal family unit, something their courts understand and respect. It is a piece of paper, yes, but it is a paper that protects." And so, they were married. It was a ceremony as unique as the community itself. A traveling Catholic priest, a kind-faced old man from a Mexican parish, performed a simple service under the cottonwood trees, his Spanish words mingling with the rustle of the leaves. He did not ask for confessions or conversions, only that they promised to honor and protect one another. When he was done, White Shell came forward. She took a single eagle feather and, with a prayer in the Apache tongue, tied their right hands together. She spoke of the two rivers that met to form one, of the two paths that had now joined. It was a binding of spirits, a promise witnessed by the mountains and the sky. There was no ring, no white dress. Their vows were the shared work of their hands and the quiet understanding in their eyes. Their fragile peace was tested again, not by lawyers, but by nature. The summer monsoons brought mosquitoes, and with them came the fever. Malaria swept through the valley, laying low the strong and the weak alike. The small clinic was overwhelmed. Sani and Nell worked day and night, brewing willow bark tea to fight the fevers and tending to the sick. They lost 3 people: an elderly Chinese man, a young Mexican mother, and a small Apache boy whom Nell had been teaching to write his own name. The funerals were simple. The community gathered, their face etched with a shared sorrow. They buried their dead side by side in a small plot of land overlooking the 2 rivers, their different traditions of mourning blending into a single expression of loss. The price of their freedom, Nell realized, was a constant, weary vigilance, not just against the outside world, but against the simple, brutal realities of life and death. The day after the last funeral, Nell felt a deep, hollow despair. She did not know if she had the strength to continue. She walked to the school grove, but she could not bring herself to start the lesson. The stones were just stones. The river was just water. Then Kane came and stood beside her. He did not speak. He just pointed, down by the river. The little girl who had asked about the Peace Bride was sitting with the boy whose mother had just died. She had a slate, and she was patiently, carefully, showing him how to form the letters of his mother's name. The boy, his face still swollen with grief, was tracing the letters with a trembling finger. Nell watched them, and the despair in her heart began to recede. The school was not a grove of trees. It was this. It was a child teaching another child to remember. It was a small, stubborn act of hope in the face of loss. They were forging a new kind of legacy, one written not in ledgers or law books, but in the shared knowledge of a community. She took a deep breath, the clean air of the valley filling her lungs. She picked up a piece of chalk. The lesson would continue. The bridge would hold. 40 monsoon seasons had come and gone, each one washing the red dust from the high canyons and swelling the 2 rivers that gave the valley its name. The people now called it Cedar Creek, for the resilient, fragrant trees that grew along its banks, the light of late afternoon, softer than it had been in her youth, cast a silver sheen across the water. Eleanor Hartley, her hair now the color of spun moonlight, sat on the porch of the small adobe house she and Cain had built with their own hands. Her skin was a fine, soft parchment, a map of a life lived under the vast Arizona sky. In her lap lay a thick, leather-bound book, its pages filled with her elegant, faded script, the Bridge Journal. The valley that spread out before her was a testament to a quiet, stubborn kind of miracle. Where there had once been only a handful of wickiups and rough shelters, there was now a community. Adobe homes with glass windows and sturdy wooden doors stood among the cottonwoods. The fields were larger, irrigated by a clever system of channels the Chinese families had designed. The small, open-air clinic was now a proper building, staffed by a young woman named Liliana, who had been that small, curious girl at the school under the trees. She was a healer who knew the properties of every root and herb in the mountains, but who also ordered quinine and bandages from a catalog, her reading and writing as sharp as any merchant's. The school was no longer just a collection of stones by the river. It was a long, low adobe building with a real shingled roof and a bell that a student rang each morning. The head teacher was a man named Samuel, one of the 2 Apache boys Cain had rescued from the alley in Terminus so long ago. He was a man of quiet authority and deep kindness, who taught history and law with a passion born of personal experience. His students, the 3rd generation to be raised in this valley, were a boisterous, hopeful mix of Apache, Mexican, Black, and Chinese heritage. They were fluent in English and Apache, Spanish, and even a little Cantonese. They knew how to set a broken bone and how to parse a legal document. They were the bridge, made of flesh and blood. The old world had not vanished. It had simply been kept at bay. The railroad had eventually pushed through, but its path had been diverted, forced to snake around the valley that was now protected by a federal designation, a result of Elizabeth Freeman's tireless legal battles and the political pressure from the Washington inquiry. The raw, ugly town of Terminus had dried up and blown away, but the main depot, a few miles down the line, still stood. It was no longer a hub of commerce. It was a museum, the Dos Rios Valley Museum. Inside its dusty main hall, behind a velvet rope, stood a single, carefully preserved glass plate, the image of the 2 boys, their faces so serious. The marks on the older one's back, a permanent accusation, was the centerpiece of the main exhibit. Around it were displayed the other artifacts of their improbable victory: a copy of the fraudulent marriage contract, the court order signed by Judge Spicer, a rusty railroad spike from the failed bridge, and a yellowed newspaper clipping detailing the fall of Horace Bell. The placard beneath it, written in 3 languages, read simply, "The tracks that failed to steal a valley." Cain came and sat beside her on the porch, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of an old man whose body remembered 1,000 miles of hard travel. His hip still pained him in the damp weather, a permanent reminder of their flight. He had given up the warrior's path, but he had never lost the warrior's spirit. He had become an elder, a keeper of stories, a man whose quiet wisdom was the bedrock of the community. He looked out at the valley, at the smoke curling from the chimneys, at the children playing by the river, and a deep, peaceful contentment settled on his face. "Our daughter comes home today," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. Nell smiled. There Sarah, a woman who carried her father's quiet strength and her mother's fierce intellect. She had been one of the first children born in the valley, and she had taken the lessons of the bridge school out into the world. She was now a respected professor at a university in New Mexico, a scholar of education and indigenous law. She was bringing a group of her own students to visit, to see the place where her theories of bicultural education were not just theories, but a living, breathing reality. Inside their home, the walls were covered with photographs, a formal portrait of a stern-looking Sani, who had become a formidable leader on the territorial council, a picture of Elizabeth Freeman, old and gray, standing on the steps of the Supreme Court, and dozens of informal pictures of their own family, of Sarah as a little girl on a pony, of community picnics, of Cain teaching a group of boys how to read the tracks of a deer. Later that afternoon, after Sarah had arrived, her laughter filling the small house, Nell took up her pen for the last time. She opened her journal to the final, empty page. She thought of the long, winding path that had led her from a Boston parlor to this peaceful porch. She thought of the fear, the anger, the despair, but also of the unexpected kindness, the fierce loyalty, and the deep, abiding love that had been the foundation of it all. She wrote, her hand sure and steady. I was sent west as a piece of property, a name on a contract, a shore to be claimed. I learned here that a life is not a piece of land to be owned, but a river that flows. It can be dammed. It can be diverted. But its nature is to seek the sea, to join with other waters. Cain and I, we did not build a fortress to keep the world out. We tried to build a bridge, a way for two worlds to meet without one destroying the other. It has been a life of standing in the middle, of holding two truths at once. The cost has been high, and the work is never finished. But a strong bridge is built by choosing to stand between two shores each day, without betraying either one. Her work was done. The story was told. Years later, when their own long shadows had finally stretched out to meet the dusk, their daughter Sarah, following their wishes, took their ashes to the place where the two rivers met. The sun was setting, turning the water to liquid gold. She mingled their ashes together and gave them to the current. The river accepted them, carrying the last mortal remnants of the Apache warrior and the Boston bride downstream, past the fields and the homes, past the old railroad depot, and out into the wider world. The water did not distinguish between them. It simply held their story and carried it on. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We would love to connect with you, so please comment with where you are listening from in the world. Subscribe to Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help share this story with even more people.